is the top of the hour. Welcome to Morning Joe, if you're just joining us. I think Joe will start this hour with the big poll numbers out of South Carolina. Big for Joe Biden. I think he has a 31-point lead over Senator Bernie Sanders and the rest of the field. Look at Joe Biden sitting in South Carolina. Democrats looking at electing him at 46% to Bernie Sanders 15%, Kamala Harris 10%, Mayor Pete Buttigieg at 8%, along with Senator Elizabeth Warren also at 8%, Cory Booker at 4%, Beto O'Rourke at 2%, tied with Andrew Yang down at the bottom there. But Joe Biden really resoundingly ahead in the polls, Joe.
Yeah, you know, I really have been surprised, Adrian, at the crowding out sort of phenomenon of Joe Biden. You had Mayor Pete, who made his announcement, got a lot of attention. Same thing with Beto, made the announcement, a ton of attention. Joe Biden sat back and wait and saw all of these boomlets. Of course, they can still, win the Democratic nomination. I know Beto's trying to relaunch himself. The other candidates are as well. But when somebody's sitting at 35% in Iowa, New Hampshire, and in the 40s in South Carolina, suddenly there is this crowding out phenomenon in political discourse, considering that Trump takes up about 80 to 85% of political talk every day. Biden now taking up the majority on the Democratic side. I just don't know how somebody sitting at 2% gets any oxygen in this field.
Yeah, you know, it's early, Joe, but then again, it's not that early. I mean, if you are at 2 or 3%, especially if you're Cory Booker in a state like South Carolina, that you need to perform very well and you need to be in the top 2 in order to progress forward in the primary, this is not good for you. And again, I know it's May, but the fact that the field is looking like this now and that Joe Biden does have this significant lead does bode very well for him, especially in a primary with 18, 19, potentially 20, 21 candidates who will be running in this. So again, you know, South Carolina is one of those states that Joe Biden doesn't have to win, but the fact that he's doing so well with African-American voters, he's able to build this coalition, Joe, that encompasses white working class voters and African-American voters. It's a very diverse coalition, which is something that a lot of other candidates need to work on forming themselves and if they're going to be able to increase their lead.
So, yeah, let's talk about the other candidates, though, because, Joe, we were talking about this last night. You've got Joe Biden in the lead, and then you've got a lot of other candidates, and some of those candidates, some who haven't even officially announced yet, who would do better possibly running for the Senate. And, the party needs a lot more than a front runner. It's going to need to really have power moving forward in the age of Trump and in the age of all these different forces. And you were talking about how some of these candidates, especially down at the bottom of the list, would do better if they would jump into Senate races.
Well, it could make a huge difference. Look right now at the chart, a Real Clear Politics chart on the 2020 Democratic nomination race from January to May. Green, obviously, is Joe Biden. Blue, Bernie Sanders. You can see that Joe Biden, after his announcement, took a good deal of support from Bernie Sanders. Biden going straight up, Sanders going down, the rest of the field remaining fairly flat. Michael Steele, there was a lot of discussion yesterday about these candidates that are polling 1% and 2%. And how they could end up in the bottom tier running for president instead of running for the United States Senate and doing something that the Democrats desperately need, and that is to win the Senate. Whether you're talking about Hickenlooper, who's sitting at 1% in Colorado, who many believe could beat Cory Gardner. If you look at Beto polling at 2%, he certainly could beat John Cornyn in Texas in the 2020 race. Bullock polling at 0%. I know he's going to announce. We'll see what happens there. But, boy, it's going to be awfully tough for him and his campaign to get oxygen. We love the guy, but it's going to be tough. He could beat Daines in Montana and Stacey Abrams, who's not even running right now. I'm pretty confident she could beat Perdue in Georgia. Now,
and she said she wouldn't run for Senate. That's the one thing she has said.
You know, Michael, what I find so humorous is it's just like Before Donald Trump got elected president, everybody said, oh, there is a blue wall in the Electoral College. It is slanted against Republicans. There's no way Republicans will never win again. Republicans win one race. And now suddenly, oh, there is a red wall. The Electoral College is anti-democratic and racist.
I like it when you do this voice.
That happened. It went from being a blue wall that Republicans could never crack to suddenly being racist. And it just lets rednecks in middle America constantly elect redneck presidents. It's the same thing with the Senate. We're now hearing that we have to go in and shred the Constitution. The Senate will forever be run by hayseeds and rednecks and racists. Michael, less than a decade ago, Democrats had 59 Senate seats, and they would have had 60 if they had won the special election. I believe it was the beginning of 2009 or 2010. When Ted Kennedy died. They got to get good candidates, and they've got great candidates to run in all these states. Instead, everybody's running for president, and they're going to let Mitch McConnell decide what the judiciary looks like for the next 40 years.
Yeah, there's a lot there, Joe, that you've touched on. Well, here's the thing. Okay, so let's look at where a lot of these folks are. I think what you're going to see is a clearing by the time you get to the fall. A lot of these folks want to try to get into that first wave of presidential debates. Why? Because it will help them make the case maybe when they decide to jump off to run for Senate, governor, or some other office. So that makes a lot of sense. I think the nature of the campaigning itself right now, particularly with Joe Biden being where he is putting the downward pressure on those 2%ers to rethink how they're going to do this, because it's impacting money, it's impacting organization, it's impacting volunteers, and a whole bunch of other pieces that they're going to need to be credible beyond just what the numbers say. So I think that's going to happen. And for the Democrats, they have to look a little bit more strategically. It's not just about running for president to beat Donald Trump. To your point, it's about a broader brush of how do we now take control of the government so that we can redirect and reemphasize the importance of things like immigration, health care, the things that matter to them. So we can get into those debates philosophically, but they have to politically decide what it is they want. Do you just want the presidency? Do you just want the House? Or do you want all of it? And then you're going to have to make that case to the American people. They're not there yet. The other thing on Joe, real quick, Joe Biden, let's see what happens when they get to that first debate. When they get those 10 or 12 folks on the stage with him, and he's got to look to his left and his right and begin to make the case against a Bernie Sanders and Elizabeth Warren, who are pushing a more aggressive agenda. How does he respond to that? And does that then begin to turn around that thinking inside the Democratic primary vote that Joe Biden may be or may not be their guy?
So this is the point that columnist Jamel Bouie picks up in the New York Times with a piece entitled "The Senate is as much of a problem as Trump." He writes in part, if they can't win a majority, Mitch McConnell may cripple a Democratic presidency from the start, blocking judicial and executive branch nominations in an even more extreme replay of his blockade of President Barack Obama's final Supreme Court nominee, Merrick Garland. Without the Senate in hand, Democrats could win the immediate fight against Donald Trump in 2020, but lose the larger battle against the Republican Party that supported and enabled him.
Bob Costa, we all remember, obviously, Merrick Garland, when Mitch McConnell just said flat out, I'm not going to let the guy get on the Supreme Court. And despite the fact that it was about as low a point for bipartisanship in Washington over the past decade, it's what he remains the most proud of. He says one of his proudest accomplishments. So I'm just curious what your thoughts are about all the Democrats running for president who actually could help win back the Senate for the Democratic Party. Do you suspect they'll stay in the race for the next 6 months if they're still at 1 or 2%, or might they jump into some of these Senate races and help the Democrats take back control of the Senate and decide who's going to sit on the Supreme Court?
Many of them will confront fundraising challenges this summer and fall as the race narrows and the field starts to consolidate. And the Democratic Party at large has to make a decision. Does it want to just win back the White House in 2020, or does it actually want to win back power as well? And if you think about Senate Majority Leader Mitch McConnell, part of his success, politically speaking, has been his ability, not just with Merrick Garland with the Supreme Court nomination, but across the federal judiciary, to overhaul that entire system by installing conservative judges, making sure he had a plan to get conservative judges nominated, then put onto all different sorts of benches across the federal judiciary. And that has changed American law and probably American politics for decades to come. And the Democrats still have not come up with a way beyond trying to get some of these star recruits to really counter McConnell in that chamber.
All right, and let's take a look at Mayor Pete Buttigieg. He's talking here about identity politics.
The more you know about exclusion, the more you think about belonging. And we have a crisis of belonging in this country. These divisive lines of thinking have even entered into the consciousness of my own party. Like when we're told we need to choose between supporting an auto worker and supporting a trans woman of color, without stopping to think about the fact that sometimes the auto worker is a trans woman of color, and she definitely needs all the support that she can get.
So, Jeremy Peters, you were at that speech. It was a fascinating discussion about identity politics. Of course, that's something Barack Obama talked about during his Mandela speech last year, but it's very much something that many voters, swing voters in Wisconsin, that you've talked to are quite interested in, and that is whether the Democratic Party is going to focus more on identity politics than what they're focusing on around their kitchen table.
And I think that's something I heard in Pete Buttigieg's voice on Saturday night there, Joe, is this frustration that he is being criticized by some Democrats out there for not being representative of the kind of struggle of the experience, the adversity that certain historically oppressed minority groups have suffered over the years. And, running as the first openly gay candidate who's really got a shot at capturing the Democratic nomination, I think that unsettles him. So what he tried to do there in a really interesting way was say, look, I don't pretend to understand the struggles of every oppressed minority group, but I do know that if we let our divisions of color, of sexual orientation, what have you, divide us, we're not going to get very far as a party. Now, it'll be interesting to see how that message plays out and whether or not he's celebrated for it or attacked more. I think generally it's been pretty well received. But, the key there, as you say, is in Obama-Trump country, what kind of candidates do the voters in Wisconsin, in Iowa, in Minnesota, Michigan, who do they want? And the idea that the Democrats could nominate somebody who voters feel doesn't really understand their needs, doesn't really understand their anxieties and their economic problems is very real. And I hear a lot of Democrats who are very worried about that, and that the economy is just good enough now in these states like Wisconsin, Michigan, that Trump does have an advantage. Now, it's a slight one because his popularity with Obama-Trump voters, as we wrote over the weekend, has really been declining. After he was elected, it was about 85% of these Obama-Trump voters supported him. Now it's slipped down to about 66% in this latest voter study group, which I encourage people to check out. It's got some fascinating information in there. But the question is really, the economy's not great. Okay, we all know that. But it's good enough for a lot of these people. And a lot of these people are going to pick that, they're going to stick with the president, the leader they know, over some Democrat who they may not feel understands their voice and their concerns in the end.
Yeah. So, Steve Rattner, a lot of Democrats have been concerned getting back to the Senate races and the desperate need for Democrats to win back the Senate if they want to control the judiciary. That's been the concern of many Democratic leaders and also a lot of candidates in Middle America, that the Democratic Party at times seems to be too focused on the blue check mark, seem to be too focused on identity politics, seem to be too focused on the things that people in Wisconsin, Ohio, Michigan, Iowa, Montana, are not as focused on. They're more focused, again, on sort of checkbook issues right now. I wonder if what you heard from Mayor Pete is something that there is a real market for in the Democratic Party right now.
Yeah, I think the tone of this unfolding Democratic primary has actually shifted a bit, and I think it is very much more focused today. And I think Biden had a good bit to do with this in terms of how he framed his narrative. It's much more focused today about beating Trump than it is about making some philosophical point about some free college tuition or Medicare for all and so on. I think a lot of those issues have receded. There are obviously people on the progressive side of this argument in the Democratic Party who want to make those points, both because they think they're morally right, but also because they actually think there are better politics. But I think the stronger argument at the moment is increasingly focused around how to beat Biden. But just coming back for 1 second. I'm sorry, Trump. Thank you, Richard. But just coming back for 1 second to this demographic point in the Jamelle Bouie piece that you referred to, the Democrats have a major demographic problem, thanks to our founding fathers, and it exists at both the Senate level and it exists at the presidential level, which is the shift in the demographics in this country toward the blue states has made it really hard for the Democrats to win. You know that Hillary Clinton won the popular vote by 3 million votes. She won California by 4.2 million popular votes, which means she lost the rest of the country by 1.2 million popular votes. And so the way this has shifted, and this is true for the Senate as well, the way the country's population has shifted is a really, really major challenge for the Democrats on both the presidential level and the Senate level.
But at the same time, Michael, still, you've had progressives bragging for years that starting in 2006, that not only has the Republican Party gone to the right, but if you look at Democratic senators, they've gone to the left.
Yes.
Sam Nunn didn't win Georgia by being a progressive champion. Boren didn't win Oklahoma by being a progressive champion. They were moderates. Lawton Childs didn't win Florida by being a progressive champion. They were moderates. Bob Graham, the same thing. I mean, get you the right candidate in the right years, and you're going to get them elected. And all we have to do is look what happened in Montana to see that to be the case in 2018.
Yeah, and I think that's really going to be the central piece for the Senate races. Look, we've got about 24 seats up on the Republican side, about 10 on the Democratic side. They need about 4 seats to flip control. And the question for the Democrats strategically and politically is where do they get that? But to your broader point about where the country is, in large measure, particularly on a statewide level or basis, the country tends to see itself a little bit more center-right or center-left, depending on the state. So how do you play to that sweet spot does matter. And I think to Mr. Ratner's point just now about the demographics, I think in addition to the demographic changes that are impacting these Senate races and the presidential races, it's also the cultural attitudes and changes that seem to be consolidating a little bit more, that Trump has tapped into and is kind of hardening that. And so that's what you've got to chip at. Do you let that attitude harden in these states, or do you work at it and chip away at it, to your point, Joe, with the kind of center-right, center-left policies and conversation that you saw with Mayor Pete there that begins to loosen people up a little bit more to start thinking more critically about what it is they really want as opposed to just how they feel.
Right. And by the way, Mika, this is exactly what the Democratic House did in 2018. They had moderates in Virginia that, guess what, were culturally aligned with their districts. They had moderates in California that were culturally aligned with their districts in California. They had retired Air Force, retired Army, retired Marines running for office. Made a big difference. We had talked about the first special election after Trump got elected in Georgia, and you had somebody that raised a ton of money but did not reflect that district so much. And then you've got to have candidates that reflect your districts or your states. The Democrats succeeded in the House doing that. They've got to do the same in the Senate to 2020. Thanks for checking out MSNBC on YouTube, and make sure you subscribe to stay up to date on the day's biggest stories. And you can click on any of the videos around us to watch more from Morning Joe and MSNBC. Thanks so much for watching.